Hello, class. We are continuing on today with the Progressive Era. And for the next three modules, we'll be looking at three presidents during the Progressive Era and their contributions to the Progressive Agenda. So today we're going to take a look at Theodore Roosevelt and how he worked to give ordinary citizens a square deal through progressive reforms. So in the last module, you learned about women who worked for reforms in their communities and for the right to vote. You learned about how women helped each other in order to deal with childcare and other work-related things so that they could be more engaged in the public process. And we also saw that women were trying to abolish alcohol, trying to get the right to vote. And in this module, you're going to learn about Theodore Roosevelt and his success in promoting reforms at the national level. These are the guided readings you'll be using. Just take a look inside your folder and grab your guided reading. Here's the terminology that we'll be focusing on during this module. There is a separate slide in case something is blocked off in this video and you need to look at it. So if you go into Schoology, there's a separate slide with this vocabulary. So take a moment to pause and look through the vocabulary and mark it on your guide if you have that area. So some interesting information about Theodore Roosevelt. He wasn't actually supposed to be president. In 1900, he was a young governor from New York, and he was urged to run as McKinley's vice president by the state political bosses because the political bosses, who we know from our last unit, like to control local governments. Well, they didn't feel like they could control him. He was a little too steadfast, and they wanted him out of state government. However, as a vice president, he was very close to being president. And unfortunately, with barely 6 months into his term, McKinley was assassinated, making Roosevelt president of the United States. So he was born into a wealthy family in New York. He had asthma during his childhood, but he was just a scrappy young man. He was very bold, ambitious, and energetic. Dare I say charismatic. People really liked him. He was active in sports and politics during the Spanish-American War, which we're going to learn about in our next mini unit. He led a unit called the Rough Riders. Actually, Kent Roosevelt High School, their mascot is called the Rough Riders. And he used his popularity to get his programs passed, these reform programs during his presidency. So he devised something called the Square Deal, and it promised common people that reforms would affect them positively. So his Square Deal included what are called the 3 Cs. Control of corporations. He was called a trust buster. So he worked to make companies have to be more fair to their workers and more fair to the consumers. He worked on consumer protection, particularly when it comes to food and drugs, and making sure that labels say what they are intended to or what's intended to be in the product, and also making sure that food is safe, and then also conservation of natural resources. He spearheaded many large irrigation projects to get water to areas of the United States that did not have free-flowing water. Like I've always said, we have the Great Lakes right by us, so we're a little spoiled in that way, but there are very arid regions of the United States that did not have water. So irrigation and dams, and then also setting aside land to just enjoy the beauty of our natural resources. Again, going back to industrialization, using different natural resources like iron ore or wood, forests. Industry was taking advantage of these natural resources and in some ways destroying the beauty of our country. So he wanted to make sure that we had land set aside that would be untouched. So the first C that we're going to look at with Theodore Roosevelt is how he handled big business or control of corporations. So in 1902, there was a coal strike, and there was about 140,000 coal mines in Pennsylvania that went on strike, and the mine owners refused to negotiate. So what happened was, and you'll put this on your guided notes, the problem is the coal strike. If you want to write a few notes under the coal strike, under the problem for your own knowledge, you can do that. But his action that he took, so the steps he took to solve the problem, was that he called both sides to the White House, and he threatened that the government would take over the mines if the owners did not try to negotiate or settle with the miners. So the two sides agreed to arbitration, and that's when a third party comes in, listens to both sides, and makes the decision to settle the differences. And the result was that they had succeeded in reaching a compromise, and the federal government would now step in to facilitate compromise in the future. Another problem that occurred that had to do with the control or trying to control corporation was trust. Trusts were a problem. So trusts controlled about 80% of U.S. industry. So these trusts or monopolies first drove smaller companies out by lowering their prices. And once small companies were gone, then they could raise their prices and they controlled the market. So trusts eliminated competition, and competition is part of the free market. So Roosevelt filed 44 suits under the Sherman Antitrust Act. And we looked at the Sherman Antitrust Act a few units ago, which basically outlawed trusts. So while this law was made, not everyone, it wasn't utilized, but Roosevelt started to utilize it. So as a result, he used the Sherman Antitrust Act, and then he gets this nickname as the Trust Buster. Another area that was a problem was unregulated big business. So Roosevelt's real goal was federal regulation of business. And in 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act set up to regulate railroads, but it was not effective. So Roosevelt fought for the passage of the following acts. The Elkins Act of 1903 made rebates illegal, which meant that railroads could not change the set rates. So if railroads had their way, they would change the rates and they would profit. But this said you couldn't do that. And then the Hepburn Act of 1906 strictly limited the distribution of free railroad passes, which was a common form of bribery. So in helping to pass these acts, which strengthened the Interstate Commerce Act, it resulted in fairer shipping rates and less corruption because industry needed railroads. They needed trains in order to move their product. So these were corrupt because they weren't regulated. So Roosevelt stepped in to help regulate this. So in 1906, and we're moving on to this idea of consumer protection. So in 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. And The Jungle was a book that talked about the meatpacking industry, and it described the filthy conditions of the meatpacking industry. It talked about how meat was on the floor and there was rats running around the meat, and there was rat dung in the meat, and that there was just, workers spitting on the meat, etc. It was just filled with bacteria. And this was meat that was going to be consumed by, average people. So what Roosevelt, after he read this, and this had received quite a stir, this muckraker publishing this book, he appointed a government commission to study the meatpacking industry. And the result was the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which calls for strict cleanliness requirements of meat facilities. And then also the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 regulated what could go into food and medicine. It said that products have to be labeled honestly. You could not add dangerous chemicals to preserve food or a drug, and you can't make false claims. You can't say a drug does something when it in fact does not do that. So these are still regulations that are in place today, and they still affect us today. So the third C, according to the Square Deal, was conservation of natural resources. So before Roosevelt became president, the government paid little attention to the nation's natural resources. And again, they had been pillaged by industry. Industry needed natural resources, and we know that the United States had an abundance of natural resources, which was one of the reasons why we were able to so effectively industrialize. But he wanted to make sure that we weren't going to ruin all of our land and all of our resources. So he supported the conservation of land, that wilderness should be preserved and used wisely for common good. So his action was that he set aside land to use for water and natural resources, water-powered sites, wildlife sanctuaries, and national parks. He established the U.S. Forest Service and also irrigation projects to bring water to areas of the United States where fresh water was not readily available. The result was the new National Reclamation Act, or the Newlands Act. Money from the sale of public lands in the West funded a large-scale irrigation project, like, for example, dams. There's a Roosevelt Dam, and set the precedent for the federal government that they would manage water resources of the West. Particularly, a lot of parks that he had established were in Oregon, South Dakota. He really loved uh, just enjoying nature. And this may be something that you and your family do. Maybe you like to go check out national parks like Yosemite or Crater Lake. Those are all part of Roosevelt's legacy as a conservationist. Now, unfortunately, he didn't do a whole lot for racial discrimination or the issues of segregation and discrimination that we talked about in the last unit. So he supported individual African Americans like Booker T. Washington, but he did not help African Americans in general. So some of the actions he did were more symbolic actions. Like, he appointed an African American as head of the Charleston, South Carolina Custom House. He invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House. But he didn't really do anything else. And the result of this was, like, W.E.B. Du Bois was upset because the progressives were pretty indifferent to race. And we're going to see this with the later presidents, too. They really don't do much about race. Some white elites and Du Bois formed the NAACP, but largely the progressive era, these progressive reforms, focus on middle-class whites. And that's who are largely going to benefit from these progressive reforms. All right. So you do have to go on and check out the Quizlet, review your notes, take your exit ticket for this module, and then you will work on your resumes or the November Madness project, depending on what class you're in. And thank you.